Hello and welcome back to the Layback Podcast. Joining me today is Dr. Nicholas Serio. Nick Serio has a ton of experience, but what he is most known for today, at least publicly, is starting Velo U, an athlete warehouse just north of New York City. This is an incredible facility. I had the pleasure of visiting it in, I guess it was the beginning of last summer. It's been awesome to get to know Nick and his team over the past year or so, be a part of what they're doing in a small capacity in just growing the knowledge of throwing and performance training in the baseball scope. I know that's why they call what they do Velo U or Velo University, because it's so much more than just training. There's an education piece to it. And that's so evident in Nick's background, from him pursuing his studies, becoming a doctor, and understanding performance psychology, as well as his own learning in undergrad. He's now gone into teaching some biomechanical work as a professor, looking at sports psychology. There's just so much to him. I'm probably butchering the intro, so I'll let Nick pick up the pieces for me. But Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully we can shed some light on the unique things you guys are doing up in New York.
Cool. So much for having me, and intro was totally fine. I'm not that interesting. But yeah, I mean, listen, thanks once again for having me on, and I'm looking forward to our combo.
Definitely. Let's look at where this thing started. It was a connection between Dean Jackson and the power of social media. I know you and Dean are pretty close. He just said, "Hey, I've got something cool in Flex Pro Grip. I think you should talk to these guys." And from my understanding, that was pretty much it. Next thing you know, we're hopping on a phone. And one of the things I appreciate about you is you get straight to the point. It's all about business. And I want to say what we probably expected to be an intro call, we're all of a sudden talking about how this integrates in a facility. How does it work into pricing structures? It's like, oh, wow. Okay. This is a guy who's serious. And there's no question that is, in my mind, one of the things that makes you successful. So I value that. It's one of the things that I've taken from you and try to implement in my own work. So I guess thank you for setting that example.
Nah, I appreciate it. That's probably just because I'm old. So I've been around and had to go through a lot of different products or different ways we were going to try and enhance our program or grow it, and realize that the greatest motto to live by is generally keep it simple. It doesn't mean that you don't try and push the envelope or try and alter things, but generally you don't want to break the foundation of what you've already built, and you want to try and implement stuff at a gradual pace. And I don't think learning is very different than that. And when you're running a business, you're just constantly learning. So it's just an adaptive view, and you're just changing that view regardless of what you're doing. And yes, Dean is a good buddy of mine. We have had a really cool relationship develop, and he did pass you guys along. And then, we got to utilize your product. We got to see how it worked with some of our guys, and try and make it another piece of something that we can provide to them. Just, again, raising sort of the bar on what we can offer them.
Definitely. And one of the things that you said in there was this slow growing process. You talked about it takes time. We're going to not necessarily drag our feet, but we're going to trudge on, make calculated decisions. And part of that, or even what I want to get into right away, was your decision to go back to school and study for a doctorate. I'm curious why you chose the path you went down. Of course, you work in the sports world, so it doesn't surprise me too much going down the sports psychology path, but I'm curious if there was a specific reason or really something that drew you to that line of study.
So I think if you're going to be a coach, you better have the capacity for vicarious joy of the success of others, right? If watching somebody else be successful doesn't drive you as a coach, you're probably not going to be a great coach. So my initial undergrad was in kinesiology, which is basically a fancy term for exercise science. And, I use that in the strength and conditioning realm. So I was a strength coach, first and foremost, working with a ton of different athletes from an array of different sports. Hence, we opened Athletes Warehouse. But I was realizing something was missing. I was only able to get them or connect to them in this one platform, right? I mean, we weren't doing really any of the skill-based teaching. So I went and got my master's in exercise science, but it was really with a focus in motor learning because I wanted to understand, like, how do we learn a skill? Skill acquisition was a huge thing to me. Going through that, we then started launching sort of the skill orientation side of what we did. And then I realized again, wait a minute, I'm not really getting the full picture because I'm not understanding why this kid could adapt to the skill acquisition principles I was applying, but this one couldn't. And I felt like I could test them in every single sort of physical test I wanted to put them under, whether it's force plate, broad jumps, you name it, I can do that. And I can understand the sort of force output and optimization there, right? But then when I'm trying to teach them a skill, okay, I can get them to learn in a bunch of these different ways, but I'm still missing something. I'm not understanding what's holding some of these guys back. And that was why I went in to get my doctorate in performance psychology. So ultimately, like, sort of my path of education was this quest for deeper knowledge in how I can help my athletes and unlock these little pieces. And what I found with psychology is I end up spending a majority of my time now when I'm working with athletes in that realm and trying to understand what's going on in between the ears, then how that parlays into how do they learn, and then how do they perform. So we try and take this sort of top-down approach with that of thinking, well, let's understand the emotional state, the psychological landscape that this athlete has and how well they manage it, whether that's in just practice or whether that's in competition. And then we parlay that into how we coach them. So really that was my route for going through sort of higher education. I would say I chose the higher education route because I needed some mandated learning. Hate reading, and it's something that I still struggle with. So it was this sort of forced avenue into going down these rabbit holes.
Beyond just your own expertise or your own studies at this point, you obviously have a large staff with specializations along the way, or else they wouldn't fit what you guys are doing. But not everybody will have the doctorate or the same background you have. So I'm kind of curious now about the systems that maybe you have implemented from your position of leadership or things that you guys have developed over time with Velo U / Athletes Warehouse to ensure that each athlete who comes through the door, their experience isn't entirely tied to which coach they work with on a given day. It's more, are they a part of the program, and what does that mean?
So I think one of the most pivotal points is the initial interaction. And then I'll say from there, it's the moment that you can get the athlete to be vulnerable, because you're going to start to learn a lot about the athlete. So that initial eval is imperative to us then assigning this athlete with the coach that we feel is going to be the best fit. Now, this coach is really just monitoring their progression throughout our program, right? And that program is going to be intricate in the sense that it'll be specific to what we've discovered throughout the eval and then what we discover as we're continuously testing them while they're training. But I think the point you're trying to hit on there is every one of our athletes is introduced, subjected, and then works with every one of our coaches. So there's never a point in time where you are just working with, let's say, myself, or just working with Tom, or just working with Coach Steven. You are getting exposed to every single coach, because ultimately, regardless if I have the knowledge in performance psychology, I've certainly exuded a lot of that onto my guys, but they also have a totally different lens, right, that they're seeing. They're different ages. They come from different backgrounds. They have a different relationship with the athlete. They might be able to make a way more close-knit relationship in terms of getting that athlete to be vulnerable than I ever could hope to. So why would I subject that athlete to only working with me? So our goal is to really create this sort of uniformed approach across all of us where we can communicate about this individual and ensure that even though I may have selected X, Y, and Z coach first that is going to monitor their progression and everything, another coach may step in and say, hey, listen, I have a great relationship with this athlete. I think I really where we need to go, and I think I can reach them. I'm going to take over their programming at this point in time. And the coaches are salaried, so they don't care if they're losing a client to another guy. It's not as if like they're being paid on that coach. So the idea is it's a sort of team oriented approach to the learning process for the athlete.
Right. It really does become a collaborative environment at that point. And as an athlete or as a parent of an athlete, you have that extra pat on the back or reassurance that whoever is best suited for the needs of the athlete at a given time, they'll be met because your staff is working dynamically. Correct?
100% correct. We probably don't do a good enough job explaining that, or as well as you just articulated it there, which is probably one of our leading flaws in sales on that, because sales generally falls to developing trust through education, right? It's a tough thing to get across in a 15-second blip that you might get, unfortunately, on social media, and you can't gain enough time from people to read an email that might explain that. But at the end of the day, yeah, that is what we're trying to accomplish. It's a dynamically adjusting ecological system that we're putting each kid into. And our objective is to constantly discover how to reach this kid and how best to sort of get them to learn. Now, it does take a lot of feedback from the athlete. There's no doubt about that. So that is one of the sort of pushbacks that we'll get from a lot of parents. If they've grown up in a household where everything's been solved for them, where they're not allowed to feel pain or anguish or struggle through things, they're probably not going to work well with our system, which is okay. We're not for everyone, and we understand that, but it isn't to say that we're going to give up on the athlete. We're going to push them to try and take more accountability and responsibility. And frankly, if they don't do it in the high school ages or even in the early college ages, their baseball careers can be over rather quickly.
Yeah, and now that we've kind of talked about the athlete experience, I'd love if you could break down what the day in the life looks like for an individual athlete as they enroll in Velo U, or they step foot in the facility or set up an online consultation with you guys. What does that beginning look like? And then through rolling out a program or just developing a system for that individual.
So our eval is based on the concept that learning is not linear, and that there's really no such thing as perfect mechanics or a singular mechanic. For that example, you never reproduce the same event the exact same way. So every pitch you throw is micro adjustments, differences, everything about it, right? What we try and do in our industry and in a lot of industries that train sports is we try and create systems, because systems afford efficiencies, and efficiencies allow volume. Volume creates money. This is why we do these things. But when you actually break it down, that's not really how people learn, and that's not really how people move. So my biggest beef with a lot of these systems or things such as that is they work for a volume of people, but they don't necessarily work for each individual. So you might be able to handle 75% of your crowd, but 25% are getting a piss poor service because that's not how they move. That's not how they adjust. These are the problems with prescribing 4 or 5 basic drills and assuming that these basic drills are going to solve everybody's sort of learning patterns, right? So our evaluation is actually about uncovering the movement biases that an individual has. So we all have these sort of intrinsic attractors, it's called, by if you ever listen to Rob Gray, he'll talk about it in terms of how people actually move is based on their perception of the environment and the skill or task they're being asked to accomplish. So what I mean by that is we'll test an individual, just to give a very clear example of what I'm expressing here. We'll ask an individual to jump on a force plate, and the manner in which they jump on the force plate really matters to us. Yes, the output matters, meaning how much force, how fast, what was the RSI, all these different performance metrics matter to us, but how they go about the jump is really important to us, because that is an expression of producing force. Now, it's an expression of producing force obviously in a very vertical plane, right? And we're going to then transition that to a very sort of linear or lateral plane with rotation built in, right? But the initial segments of this movement pattern are going to replicate that pattern very well. So theoretically, these sort of intrinsic adaptations that they've made to movement to execute a jump the best way possible should transfer over in some capacity to now the mound. So what we're interested in seeing is this individual moving similarly to how they move there in terms of how much depth, in terms of the amount of force, in terms of the asymmetry, right to left, that they're moving on the mound, or is it vastly different? And our objective from there is to determine why. Is it vastly different? Or if it is the same, then we should gear our training towards matching that style. So for example, if we have a guy that moves very shallow in a jump, I have no aspirations of training him into a deep squat in the weight room. This is an individual that is trying to express that when they want to exert force, they do not require themselves to lower their center of mass to produce the force. They are going to exert force through an extension-based system where they're going to try and extend through the ankle, knee, and hip range, as opposed to flex deeply into it in order to produce force from there. Now, it's sorry to like ramble like crazy, but just some of the nuances that are going into our sort of evaluation, the nuances that are going into the evaluation now play into how we're going to teach this athlete, right? What is the manner in which we're going to try and alter either their environment or provide constraints to maybe how they're performing actions to get them ultimately to self-organize in an effective manner. What's not going to work is sitting there specifically describing, well, you don't move the same way this guy moves, and that guy throws really hard, and you should try and move just like him. That's not going to work, and it doesn't work. And it may work for a few people, but it's not going to work for everyone. And that's sort of the flaw behind deliberate practice, is that I'm deliberately trying to adjust something, and I'm assuming that I will continuously do this and I will continuously get better. It is that we need to constantly alter the athlete's environment. We need to constantly alter their perception of their abilities in the environment. And we need to provide additional constraints to ultimately get them to self-organize in a manner that exudes the best outcome, which is hence Velo U. Generally, the initial outcome is velocity. It is the gatekeeper, the barrier to entry, right? In business worlds or in investing, right? Barrier to entry is currency, right? Your currency in baseball is velocity. There's often this argument that like, oh, we get riddled with comments like, you guys just train everybody to throw hard. You have no idea how to teach them pitching, or none of them come out of there doing well pitching. I mean, you can look up and down. We have plenty of guys that are absolutely dominating, but accuracy and velocity are not opposition. The expression of worse accuracy at higher velocities is just because the variables of freedom has increased because we're trying to increase the speed that and intensity at which we're moving, right? So we just need to do more of that so that we can vary this and then get them to organize that. This is, of course, not to ignore the fact that there are likely an enormous amount of psychological factors weighing in on this accuracy. So, sorry, rambled, but long and short, the eval is nonstop. It's always going on. It is a interaction between a system of coaches that are trying to uncover the best way to get this athlete to self-organize in a manner that will exude the result they're desiring.
I appreciate the ramble. I don't know if that was the original intention, but you covered or uncovered so many different things that we could address, whether it is the role of mechanics or the way we move, the roll, not roll, that constant ongoing debate, or, for example, the inherent biases or movement preferences of an individual athlete. I love that discussion that has really become more prevalent in the baseball world lately. And then as we talked about the whole accuracy, that's going to be on the front of everybody's mind, given the College World Series and the pitcher for Tennessee who topped out at 88 or 89. And now, of course, we're going to have that wing of Twitter and social media saying, see, all you guys are wrong. See, this is all you need to do. But of course, they don't look at
No,
that
actually,
guy's.
all that he did was he was just abnormal,
Yeah.
right? Which is ultimately the key of being a pitcher. It's just be abnormal, right? Because the only way you hit, right? Again, we can just break all these things back down. The only way you hit is by chunking. Chunking is the concept that I have seen this repetition over and over from a very similar pattern. So my brain understands the neural pathways to execute this, and it can recognize way faster than my eyes could ever adjust to where the pitch is going to be, right? And I can train it to do this. However, if I'm abnormal, then I'm outside of my chunking zone, and it becomes significantly more difficult for me to hit. So does it mean that every pitcher needs to throw 95? No, we've actually had pitchers that have increased velocity and gotten worse at pitching because it has changed the metrics on a pitch. It has changed what has made them abnormal. And at the end of the day, you need to be as abnormal as humanly possible in order to be successful. So if you throw 105, you are abnormal. But if you don't, you better have some other metric or some other avenue to disrupt the chunking of a hitter.
Right. And if we look at that guy from Tennessee and we can break down the advanced metrics, I'm sure his vertical approach angle is outlier. I'm sure his horizontal approach angle is outlier. He's a low slot lefty that's sweeping a ball. I'm sure on TrackMan it's reading between 16 and 18 inches on that slider. And you put that from the horizontal angle that he's approaching the
Well,
plate.
that's what I was gonna say. Let's figure out where he is on the right. I think he's off to the first base side anyway on the rubber. So now you're talking about a pitch that's coming 4 feet behind the batter. Good luck.
Yeah. Or even, let's face it, even to a righty, even if that's coming into you, when are you ever practicing a ball coming at you from 4 feet off the ground that's going to hit you in your right femur?
Right. So it's just outlierish. It's just abnormal, right? So regardless, for most of the time, velo is still the barrier to entry, right? It's hard to get recruited when not throwing really hard. It's not to say that you can't. It's just hard. It's a lot harder to do these things. It's a lot harder to climb the ranks in the minor leagues if you're throwing 88 to 91 than it is if you're throwing 94 to 97.
Right. Dang near everything else has to be perfect at that point. And you need
or very different.
Yes. Yeah, you either have to be a submarine guy or you have to have the off the charts K to walk ratio. You have to have the off the charts strike percentage, whatever it is. Your margin for error at lower velocities just decreases tremendously.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we were talking about this earlier. We've had a kid that got ridiculed this past year playing at a Power 5 school and blown up all over Twitter and everything like that. And thank God there is intelligent people. I don't really use social media that much. I know I'm on it a lot, like my face, but I'm not actually on it. And I got shown some of these things, and generally we take the path of not providing them the platform by answering, but it's just disheartening because number one, you're going after an 18-year-old and ridiculing him while he's trying to compete. But number two, you're stating that he stinks because he's not doing X, Y, and Z, or doesn't have the stats you think he should. Let's not forget the fact that he's getting all those opportunities at a high level school. We have a lot of kids who may have better stats and maybe didn't walk that many people or hit that many people or struggle in those things. Why aren't they getting those opportunities? Could it be that he tops 98? So could it be that, I'm going to get more of these opportunities because there is this potential there. And if I have the afforded time to work through these obstacles in a environment that is going to enrich the fact that I can grow, then I may actually be that much more successful than the kid throwing 88 to 90 who, sure, may be able to dot up, but the exit velo off of those are going to be 104.
It's a wild world, and we can look at the rights and wrongs of social media, the good and bad. Obviously, there's abundant information, which makes training and learning so much more accessible, but it also makes the negatives so much easier to find. Or, for instance, this player, I don't know his personal presence online, but that can't feel good to know that you have a small subset of people who believe in him to no end. To no end. It doesn't matter what he does. They'll always believe in him. They'll always care. They'll always love him. But those people aren't as loud when it comes to social media. It's always going to be a struggle, and I'm
It's the
sure that's something
dichotomy
you
of
work
social
with.
media.
I'm sure
Yeah.
that's what you work with athletes even now. It's kind of the modern application of performance psychology is how do you drown out the noise? My guess is you're dealing with that constantly.
Yeah, I mean, we always make the joke when we're dealing with our pro or high level college athletes. I'm not talking to them about mechanics. I'm not talking to them about like pitch crafting or anything like that during the season. We're talking about how do I manage my mental landscape? Like, how do I manage the emotional roller coaster that is baseball? I can go out there one day and throw 7 scoreless with 8 Ks and no walks and just be unbelievable. And then the next day I can go out and throw 3 innings, 4 walks and 2 Ks and give up 4 home runs. That's baseball. That can happen. And I think ultimately the athletes that excel the longest and stay the longest are the ones that have the greatest capacity to manage their mental landscape. And the more tactics and avenues for controlling this that they can learn at younger ages, better off they're going to be on that long grind, should they be lucky enough to make the minor leagues and then climb the rest of their way up. Because it's not a matter of if, it just will be a matter of when and how often they will go through periods of struggle when they're playing this game. So again, getting back to like why I got the doctorate, our hope is that we can instill a lot of these principles early on while they're in high school, create opportunities for failure within the building, create opportunities for competition. Competition breeds one thing and one thing only, and that's results. It's either going to be a positive result or a negative result. And your ability to react to that result is what's going to change your future.
One thing I want to go back on now that you've talked about this or the idea of managing a mental landscape is I do want to discuss how you guys assist an athlete with that, or maybe just athletes in general, even if they're not a Velo U client. There, there's training, there's working on your craft, there's the quote unquote mechanics, there's the way we move, whether it is in a training environment or on the field. How are you seeing athletes learn to manage these things, or what do they struggle with when they are 15, 16, 17, exposed to higher levels of competition for the first time? Or maybe they're trying something new because they realize they're not meeting that barrier to entry. They're an 82-mile-per-hour righty, and they know to reach whatever goal they have to at least be touching 90 or grabbing 92. And that's light years away, or at least seemingly it is when you're a 15, 16-year-old sophomore.
First step is meet the athlete where they are. You got to ask a lot of questions. You got to get them to be vulnerable. You got to get them to give you what they're going through, how they're interpreting their environment, how they're interpreting their world, their reality. I know that sounds like coaches don't have time for that or so on and so forth. I promise you, if you actually want to make an impact on a kid, ask questions, because they'll give you a lot more than you think, especially if you ask the right questions and you're actively listening. You're not giving them an answer before they're actually providing you the information. You're trying to understand how they're interpreting what's going on around them. So when we're doing that with athletes, right, and we're checking in with an athlete, we're not just checking in with them to say like, hey, how's training going? Good. You seem to be progressing in X, Y, and Z. Awesome. Let's continue and let's keep moving on. We're trying to say, are you understanding why we're doing what we're doing? How do you feel this is going to impact your playing this year? Honestly, where are the areas, maybe in the initial one, that you feel like we need to hone in on the most from both a mental perspective and a physical perspective? And all these things are taken into account because certainly as we close in on the high school season, let's say for the off season, right? And then for the college, when we're passing them back off in the winter, we try and create a competitive environment in the facility. A lot of our guys have big social media presence. We'll try and do stuff where they're going to be live on social media. So they got to perform. We'll try and do stuff where they're going up against another high level athlete and they got to perform for bragging rights. We'll try and create scenarios where we're applying, whether it's emotional pressure, whether it is psychological pressure because of a situation we're creating, or whether it's this sort of pressure because that they're feeling from internally, right? The fact that they want to feel successful. They want to know that all this time and energy they've just put forth is worth it. So a lot of those are situations we're trying to create within the actual facility during the time they're training with us.
I want to now kind of go down the route of applying this to the rehab landscape. And it's the notes I was making on the side for, I don't want to say it's a fear of another rambling answer, but I was curious what rabbit hole you were going to lead yourself down and what discovery we were going to make as listeners. But what I wrote down, or why I want to talk about it, is you mentioned early on in that answer the idea of taking the drill work you're doing or your workouts, your progressions, and trying to understand why you are doing them, how they'll impact performance, what will this actually influence during the competition season. And I want to spin that into the return to play landscape, because I feel like it's so easy to get stuck in the mud of doing little manuals with your physical therapist or soft tissue work or things like that, and not necessarily understanding how those things apply. And I know you guys work with athletes at any step of their journey, whether it is return to throw. There's obviously one athlete that I know you guys have who has run the whole gamut of injury, and he's fought quite the uphill battle to get back to even where he is today. I'm curious if maybe it's just the mindset that changes, or it might just be something a little bit more difficult to deal with because the athlete is returning from a traumatic experience. But how now, instead of this in the performance landscape, do you take the athlete learning or application process to the rehab setting?
So I think the biggest problem with rehab assignments in most situations is that the athlete affords way too much vicarious expertise. So they assume that the person they're working with is an expert, and they provide them too much credit, and they don't do enough of their own learning. And I think that often leads a lot of athletes down really bad paths. And I'm not trying to talk bad about anybody or anything like that, but I do think there are individuals that are qualified to do certain segments of a return to sport, and there are others that just flat out are not. I'm not going to take an athlete through the first stages of a UCL recovery coming off of a full reconstruction because, frankly, it's not what I'm qualified to do. Do I have some general awareness of what needs to occur? Sure. Would I be the best suited for that role? Absolutely not. So I do think that athletes need to do a little bit more work and a little bit more self-discovery in terms of what their process should actually look like. From there, I think ultimately we need to get an athlete to understand that the first thing, they're going to go through a bunch of stages, right? Emotional stages along this path. The initials are like, they're going to have these appraisals where they give this vicarious expertise, right? They're going to meet the surgeon, then they're going to meet, maybe their transitioning coach, whether that's a strength coach, a throwing coach, whatever. And they're going to make these appraisals. And based on the expertise they feel from that individual, they're going to appraise how successful this return is going to be, right? Now, from there, I think one of the biggest keys is they're going to have this roller coaster of emotions that they're going to go on. And a lot of them are going to fall to the problem with being a victim. So one of the most important things to get out of the way right off the chute is the I'm a victim mentality. And it's not that I don't have empathy for somebody going through an injury. It's that if you sit there and you have this victimized mentality during that point in time, I promise you, you will blunt your return drastically. It is one of these scenarios where if an athlete gets into this mentality, they will end up leading themselves down a phase where they can make excuses. They will compromise with themselves. They won't take the attention they need to learning. And the unfortunate scenario there is they will end up getting massively frustrated at the end point of this. What ultimately needs to occur is that they need to reshape sort of their identity. And that's a lot of what the experts that are hopefully working with them are aiding them on. It's getting them to understand that their identity hasn't shifted. They are still who they are. They're not broken. They're not damaged. They're not the potential of what they saw. The idea is this is just a moment and an opportunity, and we need to decide how we're going to react to this opportunity. I think ultimately, much like learning processes, much like drill work or anything else like that, right? We blanketly prescribe a scenario for returning an athlete and assume that that's going to work for everyone. As I said before, it will work for the masses, but it is not what a coach should be setting out to accomplish. There are a lot of nuances that we include into a lot of our return to throw protocols. There are a lot of times where we're trying to get ahead of some of these fear of pain, some of the fear of movement, kinesiophobia, and trying to get sort of this athlete to relinquish some of the emotional baggage that has been built up from this absent time of where their identity is really attached to throwing. You've now asked them to take all this time away from a thing that really attaches them identity, and they're going to severely judge these first few times that they're going to come back throwing on the future success of their entire throwing protocol. So I think that is an incredibly, incredibly pivotal time period. We use velocity, we use different stages of conversation, and we also don't generally use we'll use some distances as parameters, right? But we often are trying to get the athlete to feel as fluid and as natural as humanly possible. So we will actually implement different movement patterns within their return to throw, not just have these static shuffle behind and go and throw. We're trying to get them to self-organize again. It's no different than regular learning.
That last piece you hit on with kind of constraint-based throwing or external targets, different things of that nature in the throwing program, I have found that to be a very successful, incredibly useful tool. Dylan Newcomer, the physical therapist out at Driveline, talks about it as setting athletes up in a way to avoid corrosive patterns. Instead of just letting a guy go out and return to a pushy arm swing or, like you said, a step behind, whatever, it might not be what is most important for that or most useful for that athlete in that given moment. And they might not get to experience the complete open chain freedom of throwing that they did once before, but you can build these constraint-based drills or movements that enable an athlete to take the little leaps along the way to eventually return to the full throw. It's the building blocks instead of just going from 0 to 100 again.
So generally, an athlete gets to a pushy arm or gets to these corrosive patterns, as he calls it, right? Because they're ultimately afraid and they are trying to accelerate this thing that must be in an acceleration mode in order to project this object, right? And they're trying to decelerate it because they're afraid of pain. They're afraid of movement. They're afraid of what it looks like to themselves. They're afraid of not being good. They're afraid of never achieving who they thought they were going to be. Like, you got to remember, all those things are going through their head. And the unfortunate thing is they're going through their head at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Every single one of those is being said. They're all being said subconsciously, and they're probably being said on every single throw. So our objective is to try and minimize the variabilities initially, and then start to layer on variabilities as they start to get more and more comfortable. So typically we'll actually start guys seated on a box and have them just experience the rotational capacity of the torso. Remove the legs from the scenario, take a lot of the pressure off, close your eyes, throw to a wall, no target. We'll start them 2 weeks out before throwing, utilizing different objects other than a baseball to feel these rotational capacities. To maybe they're using a club, maybe they're using a med ball, a basketball, all these different apparatuses to get them to feel general rotation again. So if they can start to feel normal with general rotation, then by the time we get to throwing of an arm, all we have to tell them is, hey, just focus on what your torso felt like before, and just try and move your torso through this. And now they can take it away from just the hand. What we also have to remember is I can move in 1,000 different ways. But if my objective is to throw a ball to a wall, I can execute that throw 1,000 different ways, which means there are no perfect mechanics. If I didn't have an end result that mattered other than hit the wall, right? Because that's an easy task. I can have a ton of variabilities for that easy task. If I start narrowing the task, like, hey, now I want you to hit within a 4-foot radius of that. Well, I start to refine how many different ways I can move. If I start to refine that task even further, which is, now I want you to hit a 17 by 24 area, I'm refining how many different ways I can move again. So my degrees of freedom are going down because the constraint of the task is becoming more difficult. My perception of movement is changing because my environment and the constraints of the task are changing. But I haven't even actually changed the environment yet. Next, I can have them stand and try and execute that. Now I've changed the environment. Then I can have them stand on a balance pad and do it. I've changed the environment again. I can change the weight of the ball. I've changed the constraints of the task. All these different variables, they refine the degrees of freedom we're allowing the athlete to have. And ultimately what they end up doing is they teach the athlete to self-organize because they're giving them an end result they want to accomplish.
I like this progression a lot. I really like the idea of starting vague or general, a goal that is very obvious yet very easy to accomplish. And I don't know if this is maybe what you were alluding to, but I do think that often gets missed in rehab. That might be an easier way to, one of the things we talk about a lot on here is, how do you find those small victories? It's honestly a way to get more victories early on and build that confidence. If my throwing
100%.
program on the first 2 times I go out isn't trying to throw to a partner, because that's stressful. It really
Listen,
is, because you're thinking about everything.
This is what happens when you have programs written by people who don't typically throw. Okay. And they're telling an athlete that they need to go out to 45 feet. 45 feet. That's not close. And I know that they think that's close, but it's not close. At 45 feet, and asking them to hit a target that's the size of a glove, that they are going to strictly judge internally how well they hit that target, how accurate they were, what's the sound that it made, because don't forget, they are connecting that to previous sounds that they've done. All these different variables that they are going to intake, you are now asking them to do that 20 times. Then you want them to move back 15 to 20 more feet and execute it at 60 to 65 feet for another 20 throws. When the first 45, there may not have been the quote unquote pain, but the athlete felt terrible about those first 45 throws. There is nothing about a return to throw that should be generalized. Nothing. Except ultimately, perhaps, how does this athlete respond to the given stimulus that we've done? Do I scale up or do I scale down? Do I increase the difficulty of the variable or do I increase the difficulty of the task? Do I alter the environment? How do I do this? And that's the art of being a coach. I know everybody wants systems. I know everybody wants something to be plain and simple and here, just go do this, because that's the nature of our society and we want the gratification. But the unfortunate thing is that if you want it to be really successful, you have to develop large individual nuances.
Really, to me, it stresses the importance of the word dynamic when you talk about systems. Because yes, systems are great. It makes everything easier to implement because it isn't starting from scratch every time you get into something. But if you trust that your systems are dynamic, like you said, you then start to play with the knobs. Are you adjusting them up? Are you adjusting them down? The bass, the treble, the volume. It's just how you listen to music in your car. You can customize your own experience within a given structure. And
100%.
to me, that's kind of what you've guided me and the listeners through in this return to throw process. Yeah, we know where you're starting, which is 0. We know your goal is to reach the mound again, reach your previous velocity, or maybe throw harder, but it's to get back and compete again, wear the jersey, stand on the rubber, and chuck a ball 90 something miles per hour towards home plate. However, there's a lot of variables in between to get to that point that's 14 to 16 months away if you're returning from TJ reconstruction. And truthfully, why make it harder than it needs to be? So figure out how to scale down or scale up over time to build those victories, those wins, and leave sessions feeling good about yourself or knowing that you challenged yourself. And even if you didn't complete the challenge that you set out to, you at least recognize what success looks like and maybe where you fell short or what adjustments you can make in the future. Not beating yourself up to the sense that, how am I ever going to accomplish this again? Because if your throwing program starts with, I have to make the glove pop, whoever I'm throwing with is going to kill me if I overthrow them again. If I leave the ball short, they're going to kill me and say I'm babying the ball. Now my shoulder's starting to hurt because I'm so concerned about my elbow. And all of a sudden you've created all these obstacles that weren't there in the first place that just make the path harder.
100%. And I do want to clarify, it is not that we don't have frameworks that we are constructing around a path that we believe an athlete is going to follow, because we've had a lot of experience bringing athletes through these things. Of course, we're going to have frameworks, but it is the job of the coach to be the artist to paint in between the lines and then create new lines when needed. And they have to navigate sort of that and discover how to get them to the end point and realize that, you know, if an athlete is amazed that some athletes have a way more walls put up than others, and that trip around the maze may be a lot longer for some than it is for others.
Yes. And I think that's the beauty of it, though, is nobody moves the same. Nobody's mind works the same. It's how do you surround yourself with people that can help you, as well as how can you weaponize or educate yourself to better handle these situations. And this is a conversation that I've now had with a couple different people on here, but it is the purpose of a network or a mentor. It's how do you take some of that burden off yourself and rely on others who maybe have done it before or have experience in this field. And I know we talked about earlier is it is very important to not just blindly trust. You should go through some learning on your own. There's no question about that. But it's how do you develop the network that you know can help guide you, because there are going to be a lot of obstacles and this is going to be very hard. but you aren't going to be the first person to rehab, and you're certainly not going to be the last person to rehab. Whether it's constructing a team, finding a team, or just an army of people that you can rely upon to help you get through it.
100%.
Yeah, and I don't know if I intended to go down the return to play or return to throwing rabbit hole, but this was certainly a fun one. I'm glad we ended up on it. I like the way you phrased a lot of that. And I like to think that there are plenty of things that can be pulled from that. There's no question these things are actionable because no matter where you are, if you're throwing, if you're doing a return, you should be able to find a wall or a fence and put
100%.
yourself 15 feet away from it.
Yep.
And you're going to have a physical therapist or a coach or somebody that you're doing a throwing program with. Or maybe you don't. So be it. As you build that over time, eventually that small target that you have to hit might be the bucket on the other side of the field. And there's ways you can challenge yourself. Like we said, you're not going to be the first person to rehab. You're not going to be the last person to rehab. Plenty of people have found creative ways to do this. And now going back to the beauties of social media, I guarantee you can find people that have gone through maybe not the exact same, but a very similar obstacle that you might be dealing with. So don't
100%.
be afraid to speak up in rehab.
Yeah. And like I said before, echoing, you're not the first, you won't be the last. Remove the victimism. You got to get rid of that. You got to work on it. I don't mean to try and sound harsh there, but I promise you, if you're taking it as harsh, let me be the enemy then, but get rid of it because it's not going to help you in anything you do in life.
Right, because then you're, especially in this situation, you're dwelling in the sadness or the woe is me mindset. And truthfully, in the grand scheme of things, like, there's a reason we work in the baseball world. It's because we love it and we're passionate about it. And I know how much you care about getting athletes better. For me, it's keeping guys on the field. It's why we develop Flex Pro Grip. It's trying to give them an edge. It's something like that. But sticking in the pain is just a recipe for disaster. Yes, the pain sucks. It's miserable. Having surgery was one of the most physically painful things I ever endured. But what I talked about on a previous episode was what I struggled with mentally after that was so much worse than the physical pain of it all. And it's because I lost sight of who I was. And you hit on that earlier, which is the identity piece. I think it's incredibly important. We just talked about it previously, but reiterating that is you might not have the same physical capabilities, whether it's in this moment or after you even finish your return to play, but you still have all the same qualities as a person. And there's so much more than just the ability to throw a ball. So I just want to make sure that gets thrown out there again.
Yeah, I think oftentimes people believe, or whether they believe it or not, they act as though their identity is terminal. It is what you are today is what you are moving forward. Your identity is constantly adapting. It is constantly growing. Who you are today does not have to be who you are 5 years from now. It doesn't have to be who you are tomorrow. You can always adapt. You can always realize that there is something you can do to change your world. And when you realize that, you take back the control. You take back the control from fear. You use fear as an energy source as opposed to something that keeps you burdened and down. It's an opportunity for you to become aware of who you are, realize who you want to be, and then stop at nothing to go and get that.
I think that's stated well. And this is probably a good spot to round out the more serious part of our conversation and flip the script a little bit to Nick, what are you excited about coming down the line? Whether it's personal research, are you going back to school again? Anything that you have coming down the pipeline, whether it's personal discovery or with the business in general that you're willing to share?
With the business, we're constantly striving to solve a bigger problem. So we've actually just made a recent partnership where we're going to be conducting research in-house now regularly. Our objective is to try and get anywhere from 6 to 10 research studies going on every single year. Hopefully what that does for us is provides us new problems to go out and solve. What else has me excited? The conversation we just had right there at the end, and I'd be remiss to not talk about how I've seen that work in reality. I had a very long high school coaching career, and the reason it came to an end was I watched one of my son's lacrosse practices, and it was horrible. He was just really bad. And I brought him home, asked my wife to go inside, and him and I had a little come to Jesus conversation at the top of our street where, I informed him, listen, you're not fast, you're not good, you're not strong. Like, these are realities I need you to become aware of. Obviously there were some tears and everything, right? But the truth of the matter is this: they don't have to be an end result. That isn't, just because that is who you are right now doesn't mean anything. It only means that if you're allowing yourself to become complacent and you allow yourself to believe that that is who you will always be. So I think what's been really cool for me is I have actually been working with him a lot more. I'm learning a new sport. I have trained several lacrosse athletes across my career, but I haven't gotten into the weeds with it. And I've enjoyed watching him progress and grow. So on a personal note, that has been really awesome. So it's been cool to watch progression happen, even when I'm that close to it.
And like you said, it's learning a whole new sport, and I'm sure it means that much more because you were doing it with your son as opposed to an athlete just showing up at the facility with a problem and needing it solved. Now it's within the family.
Really cool. And I honestly, the reason I had to stop coaching was because I probably treated all those athletes just like they were my son. So I needed the available, like, sort of focus and emotional space to focus on him. But it's been cool. It's been awesome. I'm excited for that to continue. I'm excited for what I'm learning. He's 10, so I'm constantly learning how he's experiencing it, and then how can we use some of these tactics in-house.
And then another question about your son. You told me something that I loved because it's the foresight of a performance coach, somebody who understands the human body. You told me when he elected to stop playing baseball, you still wanted him to continue throwing so he could get the humoral retro version in case he ever does decide to pick up a ball again and play. He can get maximum external rotation within a degree similar to baseball players, at least, as opposed to those who pick up a ball post-puberty. So is he still throwing? Has he stayed committed to chucking balls at the wall of your house 3 times a week?
So we have scaled back from that. Because we did make another route going towards baseball this year, and that was the final straw for him. He was sick of it. My reason for, saying like, okay, cool, we'll back away, was sort of just the sheer aggression he had towards trying to get better at lacrosse. So I was like, all right, listen, you have an obsession, we'll feed the obsession. Let's go.
That's right. Who cares what sport it is? If you want to be as good as you can possibly be, I'm all in.
I mean, listen, it didn't even have to be a sport. For a little bit it was video games, and I said to him I wasn't going to accept just, playing to play. Like, try and grow a YouTube presence, try and do something with it. You have to try and be great at something. That's the only objective.
Yeah, I think it's a cool tool to have, or understanding that you can be different or successful in any field. I guess this does kind of tie back into the identity piece, and I encourage guys who are in the rehab process to explore those other interests. It becomes a little bit harder when you're in season, you're healthy, you're competing, you're practicing all the time. But whether it's reading or, like you said, playing video games and going on YouTube or trying to play competitively, different things like that, there's so many different outlets, and exploring those can be incredibly valuable, whether it's for personal growth or potentially the long-term success of it could yield some decent results.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, Nick, unless there's anything that we left off the table that concludes my questioning, anything else you want to sprinkle out for us?
No, I'm good. Listen, every human should challenge themselves every single day they wake up because they're blessed to have woken up to try and focus on one thing that made them that much better today. And I promise you, you will find value in every day you're awake. Striving to be the same will kill you and will kill you fast.
Well, I appreciate that. Those are great parting words. How can people reach you or velo you if they want to reach out?
VeloUniversity.com, at Velo University on Instagram. TikTok, I have no idea. I think it's the same thing. And then at coach_Serio on Instagram. However, fair warning, I'm never on. So it'll be one of our media guys answering.
Great. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, making yourself accessible. Again, thank you so much for the conversation today. And all our listeners out there, thanks for laying back with us.